faith breaker for people. Two, it may very well be the last talk I really do in a ministry position. And three, because I want it to mean something to everybody, not just be something that I try to dive into theology. I want it to be something personal. And so, as I do this, what my hope is that in some ways I'm going to touch on some theology, but in some very broad strokes. So it might give you something to think about. Just plant a little seed. I hope that on some level what I have to say inspires you. My wife says I'm very inspirational. She says that every morning I inspire her to do a better job of letting young college girls know to wait to get married. True story. And I also hope that there's something in this that each one of you can relate to. It won't be the same thing, but I hope that there's something that you can relate to. Because, as you'll hear me say later, everybody experiences suffering in some form. And so, I want to start by explaining kind of how I'm going to go through this. I have this theory about 3 levels of internalizing knowledge. And I think some of it sounds really similar to Lawrence Kohlberg's levels of moral development. If anybody studied that in a counseling or social work or psychology background, he had these 3 levels. And I think the reason some of that found its way into my talk is because of my own school. But the first level is when you know the answers because somebody told you. So you can regurgitate memorized information. Okay, but that's as far as your understanding goes. The second level is when you have enough experience to recognize the implications of the facts that you've memorized. So you can speak from knowledge mixed with some experience, but you're in an active learning phase at that point. Okay? And then the final level is when you have fully internalized the information and you're able to speak not from a place of knowledge, but from a place of wisdom. And you can almost seem prophetic in the things you have to say to people. And I'm sure we've all met somebody like that, okay? And so these things, I believe they exist on a spectrum, and you can't skip ahead in the spectrum without, you have to pass through each phase in order to get to the third. If I had to label myself on suffering and an understanding of suffering, I'm probably somewhere on number 2. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who are very prophetic about suffering because of their journey. And everybody's experience with suffering is going to be a little bit different. And so I don't claim to be the expert, but what I can share is the way I've learned to make sense from suffering based on a variety of sources, as you will soon find out. In fact, Jamie, can you bring my books up? I forgot to bring my books up. Anyway, so to start with, level 1. Level 1 is a very concrete level. And we start with the question, why does suffering exist? It's a foundational question. It's a faith breaker for some people. Why would God allow this or put me through this? And I'm not going to get deep. I'm going to give you the best answer I've ever heard on this. It was in a homily by Monsignor Francis Mannion at St. Vincent de Paul Parish in Salt Lake City, Utah. He said, why does suffering exist? Because we have a God who suffered and who still does. And he referenced Matthew 25, the judgment of the nations, where Jesus says, Whenever you do this for somebody, whenever you feed the hungry, clothe the naked, you do it for me. And whenever you fail to do it, you fail to do it for me. So what Jesus in essence is saying, whenever you fail to feed the hungry, you force me to go hungry. When you don't visit me in prison, then you leave me lonely in prison. Okay, so we have a God who suffered and who still suffers. And to me, that makes a ton of sense. But we also can look a little deeper in Scripture, and as Catholics, we say suffering has a purpose. But what? What's the purpose? And in 1 Peter, our first Pope says, it's chapter 1, he says, although now for a little while you may have to suffer through various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, that is perishable, even though tested by fire, may prove to be for praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And he goes on to say, as you attain the goal of faith, the salvation of your souls. So suffering purifies, and it attains salvation. So it has salvific qualities as well as purifying qualities. Some Catholic theologians believe purgatory starts on this earth. And I would agree with them. I would be in that camp. I think that we begin the purification process through suffering in this life. And it would make sense because my wife always tells me I'm going to be in purgatory a long time. So I had to start early to get a leg up so we can both walk through the gates together. So it has a salvific quality, and it has a purging or a purgatory, a purifying quality. And the third reality, concrete reality, I think, that we have to admit about suffering is that God chooses some people to suffer. And there's no way around it. One of my favorite stories from the book of Acts is when Paul, the Apostle Paul, then Saul, is running around throwing people in prison that are Christian, right? And he's on his way to Damascus, and he has this experience where he loses his sight, and he's told to wait. Meanwhile, the Lord goes to a man named Ananias, and he says to him, hey, and Ananias answers, here I am, Lord. And he says, I want you to go to this particular place, and there waiting is a man named Saul, and I want you to pray with him, and he's going to regain his sight, and he's going to go do these great things. And Ananias is a little scared about this, because he knows about Saul, and he says back to Christ, Lord, I've heard about this guy, and he's a bad guy. Are you sure? And then listen to the Lord's response. It says, this is Acts chapter 9. He says, but the Lord said to him, go, for this man is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before Gentiles, kings, and Israelites, and I will show him what he will have to suffer for my name. Chosen, suffer. That verse gives me chills every time I read it. The Lord had predestined Paul. He knew at some point that this bad guy was going to change and was going to be called to be the greatest evangelizer probably in the history of Christianity. Okay? So God chooses some people to suffer. And so level 1 has some sort of concrete answers, and people on level 1 in suffering will say things like, well, just offer it up, you know, or everything happens for a reason. And while those are really well-intentioned things to say to somebody who's suffering, I just don't think they help a whole lot. They don't help me. When you're in the midst of pain and frustration, that is sort of like your mom saying when you're in a bad mood, snap out of it. You know? And some people even say, I understand, but be careful with that, because if you haven't been through something like that, you really don't understand. It's like me saying to a pregnant woman, well, I know what you're going through. No, I don't. You know. So those are sort of level 1 things. And to move to level 2, and because those things didn't help me much at all, even if I said them to myself, I wanted to look at suffering from some different perspectives. And so I started to look around. And what I found is, I think as you enter level 2, you face another hardcore reality. We just covered 3, but we face like the next level. If this is a video game, this is the next challenge in level 2. And the reality that you face and you have to accept in level 2 is that suffering is unavoidable. Everyone's going to suffer. And one of the books I read that I really like and really makes this point, does anyone know who Viktor Frankl was? A few of you, raise your hand. Let me see, I'm just curious. Viktor Frankl was a survivor of the Auschwitz death camp. He was a psychiatrist before he went in, and when he came out, he continued in psychiatry. He survived Auschwitz. He went in, that was his first camp, and it was a death camp. It wasn't a work camp, it was a death camp. And he went in to Auschwitz first, and he survived it till it was liberated. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It's an outstanding book. I highly recommend it. And in it he talks about the couple things. One is the tragic triad, which is everyone's going to experience suffering, guilt, and death. Now, if anyone was concerned because I might be going off of a Catholic theological line of thinking, what could be more Catholic than suffering, guilt, and death? Right? Welcome to Lent. Right. So don't worry, okay? And Frankl says that, these things are absolutely inevitable. And this lines up really well with Christ's own words when he says in John 15 that no servant is greater than their master. They persecuted me, I'm going to suffer, you will too. It's unavoidable. It will be different for everybody, just like our journey to Christ is different. But it's unavoidable. It's going to happen. And he developed a therapy model called logotherapy, which he lectured on and taught until he died. And by the way, he was a practicing Jew, and his first wife died in the concentration camps, and he married a practicing Catholic after he got out. And they went to each other's services each weekend. He's mentioned that in his lectures several times. But his point was that the main principle of logotherapy are 2 things to deal with. One is that he believes that humans have an existential vacuum they must face. And that is the idea that people feel their life is meaningless until they can give it meaning. Okay? Now, that to me sounds a lot like original sin in different words, kind of, doesn't it? But he also said that since suffering is inevitable, the only way to deal with it is to do what he called transmute it. Okay? And so I want to read a quote. I hate reading quotes when I speak, but you just can't paraphrase Viktor Frankl. So here's what he says, and this is pretty heavy words. This was written decades ago, but think about it in terms of our society today as well. He says, sometimes there is unavoidable suffering confronting man. That man is a being which sooner or later must die, and before doing so must suffer, despite the advances of science so much worshipped by progressivism and scientism. Closing one's eyes before these existential facts of life means reinforcing our neurotic escapism. Avoiding suffering as much as possible is desirable, yes, but what about inescapable suffering? Logotherapy teaches that pain must be avoided as long as it is possible to avoid it. But as soon as a painful fate cannot be changed, it not only must be accepted, but may be transmuted into something meaningful, into an achievement. So Frankel's saying you could transmute or transform, if you want to say, your suffering into an achievement. And that is the answer. That's his answer. And he writes a lot about this in his works. I recommend it. They're great books. But if you summarize his position, and he says this also several times, he says, we cannot escape suffering, nor can we control it. But what we can control is how we respond to it. That is within our control. And that therein lies the challenge. There's a quote that's going to transmute us, transition us into level 3 that I want to read to you from his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, he kind of talks about the duality of man, the evil that man is capable of, and the response that we have control over. It's a very powerful quote. It was the quote that he originally ended his first book with, but since then there's been additions. And he says, in Man's Search for Meaning, he says, our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Israel on his lips. How do we respond? And that is what takes you to level 3 in the video game, for playing this video game here. I say that because when I used that analogy earlier, Paul started laughing, so I had to make Paul smile again. So I believe that level 3, the final level, is the level where saints are made. And I eventually, and some of my medical conditions that contribute to other things have been something I've been battling since about 2013. And I'd like to say that by 2014 I'd figured this out, but it's just not true. It's only been the last probably 4 or 5 months when I started, instead of thinking about what hurt or, being frustrated, I said, okay, let's refocus here. How do I find meaning in this? And more importantly, what does God want me to learn from it? Because apparently there's something that God's trying to teach me here, and I need to find it. And therein is where I'll find the meaning. And so this is the question I asked, and this is a question I prayed about a lot. And it's kind of funny. God answers your questions in really strange ways sometimes. But a couple years ago, my brother gave me a book for Christmas, my atheist psychiatrist brother. And this book sat on my nightstand for years. I mean, it's been sitting on my nightstand since we moved to Pocatello. I keep meaning to read it, and I just don't get around to it. And the more I prayed, the more I felt like I was supposed to read this book. And I'm just thinking to myself, what possible message could there be that's decent and holy and pure and good from a book that my brother gave to me? I'm like, it's probably something that pornography disguised as something else just to be an ass, because that's my brother. He would do something like that. But I just kept feeling like I should open this book. So I said, I'm going to open it and read one chapter. And if I don't like it, I'm just going to donate it. Well, the first night I opened it, I read 5 chapters. Then I finished it in the next couple of days. And the answers to what I am trying to learn, or what God's trying to teach me, really in a lot of ways came to me through this book. They're very Christian. There's nothing in these that's not in line with our beliefs as Catholics. But I eventually narrowed everything down to 6 things. And I believe that these are tools that the author talks about them as tools for survival, but they're things that are missing from my life. And the more I prayed about these things, the more I felt like this is what God wanted me to learn. And suffering or no suffering, if they're a part of my life, it makes me a better person. It pushes me along the path to sainthood. And I don't mean I'm going to be canonized or something. I'm just saying we're all on that path to sainthood. Anyone in heaven is a saint, right? And so that is what our purpose here is to follow that path to sainthood. And so I came up with I came up with 6, and that's going to be level 3. Now, just because they're in level 3 doesn't mean I have them. I'm working on them. Sometimes I do well, other times I do pretty terrible. So it's those times I send Father Stephen a text and say, "Are you going to visit me this week so I can confess?" Anyway, the first one is what the author of this other book calls the first rule of life, and it's be here now. Be here now. It's mindfulness. It's the idea that you strive to be fully present wherever you are, in your mind and your body. This is hard. This was hard for me because I've always been 20 things ahead in my brain. Whether it's a conversation or whatever I'm doing, I'm never right there. I'm thinking, well, I got to do these 5 other things today, and I got to do this, and I got to do that, and I can't forget to do that. And in youth ministry, you're always planning the next event. So before you're done with the event you're doing, you're thinking about the next month calendar, and you miss everything when you're not fully present. This is also this goes along well with monastic thought, but to be here now, to be fully present, to be mindful, to take things one day at a time, or 1 hour at a time, or 1 minute at a time. In recovery, and I've mentioned it before, I'm in recovery, been in recovery 12 years, didn't figure out what they meant by 1 day at a time until recently. But it's mindfulness, okay? I'm practicing learning how to be fully present to my current situation without getting ahead of myself. So that's number 1. The best way I can sum it up from Scripture is Psalm 46. It begins, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. And often in centering prayer, that's just what I'll lay there and think to myself. Be still, know that I am God. God is with me. I'm here right now. Be still, know that I am God. Number 2 is a tough one for me as well. Acceptance. Acceptance is the ability to acknowledge what is. And I'll bet a lot of us have problems with that one. Right? It's funny because in the 5 stages of grief, it's the last stage. You go through anger and denial and all these other things before you finally get to acceptance. Okay? But being able to acknowledge what is. But I want to add something to it. In this other book I read from my brother, it says that to survive difficult situations, whatever they are, you have to embrace an attitude of what the author calls active passivity, which means accepting what is without giving into it. And so I have to wake up in the morning and say, yes, I hurt. Yes, it may never go away. But that's okay. Because nobody gets out alive anyway. Right? And when the author of this book, the book is called Deep Survival. It's a great book. But he says that survivors who are lost at sea or who miraculously recover from terminal illness or who were lost in the mountains for months, once they accept what is and accept the fact and stop worrying about dying or what their problem is, that they are able to get into a routine that oftentimes can carry them through whatever is happening. So they accept the limitations that they're facing, but they don't give in to them. St. Benedict's rule says, day by day remind yourself that you're going to die. And it's just this idea that I have today. When I wake up, and people who are in pain or struggling wake up, they can say, yes, there's all this happening, but I have today. I don't know about tomorrow, but I have today, and I will be reconciled with God today, and I will do my best, whatever way I'm capable, to love my neighbor today. And that's fine. That's enough. I love St. Thomas More. He wrote to his daughter from the Tower of London while he was imprisoned awaiting execution. He says, nothing can come but what God wills, and I am very sure that whatever that may be, however bad it may seem, it shall indeed be the best. And so this acceptance, this acknowledgement of what is, also means accepting God's will. For whatever reason, this difficulty you're going through right now is God's will. And you have to be okay with that on some level, even if you don't always know why. The third one is patience. Oh boy. A bunch of husbands just looked at their wives. I've never lost my temper with a teenager. Ask Jamie. In 20 whatever years of working with teens, I've never once lost my temper with a teenager. But that's the only place that I've never lost my temper. I'm not a very patient person. I've never been. No one in my family is patient. And in the midst of suffering, I'm learning that things are not going to happen in my time. They just aren't. No matter what I'm doing, I'm learning that. Whether it's doctor's offices, how well medications work. Sometimes they switch my meds and it takes weeks to figure out whether it's going to do any good. I'm like, weeks? Why can't we figure this out right now? I have to slow down. Even if I'm just at home and I'm walking around the house too fast, I have to stop myself, take a couple deep breaths, slow my pace down. If I get too riled up, the pain comes, So, patience, it's hard. It's hard to learn. But I'm learning, a lot about what it means to wait in silence. I can only talk so much each day. I have to be patient with progress. I have to slow down. And I spend a lot of time in silence and a lot of time in prayer. And waiting in silence is what we say in Advent and stuff. That has taken on a whole new meaning for me. And in the midst of suffering, I think it's important that we remember that there is great, great value in waiting in silence and enduring. And in Romans chapter 5, St. Paul says, affliction produces endurance, and endurance proven character, and proven character hope. So I'm learning patience. And I wish it would hurry up. Number 4 in level 3, I think, is learning self-control and restraint. And, whatever you're dealing with, however difficult it may be, I can't imagine any kind of suffering that doesn't force you to learn some form of self-control. It can be in your words. For me, I can't talk very much, so I have to limit my talking. It can be in your actions. I've been a pretty physical guy my whole life, and now I try to go work out twice a week with my friends, and if it works out that I do, I am so thankful. I'm so happy. The whole way home, I'm praying a rosary of thanksgiving that I was able to go work out for 45 minutes. So you have to use self-control in your actions, maybe, in the suffering you're enduring. And even in your thoughts, because I know if I let my thoughts start going into next week and next month, and how am I going to do this, and what are we going to do, and how are we going to pay medical insurance, and blah, 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 that stresses me out. And what happens when I get stressed? The pain level comes up. So I have to be very zen about things. Oh, okay, But it's a form of self-discipline that you have to learn, and it's not the easiest thing to develop. But I mentioned Auschwitz earlier. Maximilian Kolbe. Does everybody know who Saint Father Maximilian Kolbe was? He said, "We must overcome ourselves in small matters. If we are not faithful in small things, God will not give us grace to do greater ones." So suffering or no suffering, self-restraint and self-control, good things to have a part of your Christian life. Also something that's dealt with a lot in the Rule of St. Benedict, but I already quoted that once, so we'll move on. Number 5, flexibility. See my wife smiling. She knows I haven't been flexible about anything in 19 years, 21 years that she's known me. I haven't been a very flexible person. I have a way I want things to go, and by God, they're going to go that way if I have to kill myself making them happen that way. Which could be part of the reason why I'm having problems now.
You were trying.
But I'm going to win. I like to say I'm determined. I think that sounds better than rigid. But if you're going to endure suffering, you have to be flexible. It doesn't matter what it is. If you've had a loved one who has some kind of very bad illness or terminal illness that you have to deal with different things each day, or you've lost somebody that's close to you and you never know when the grief's going to hit you, you just have to learn to be flexible about what to expect each day. And every morning I wake up and I just don't know what kind of day I'm going to have, and I just kind of look at it as a little adventure. And when pain starts to come somewhere, especially when it's somewhere new, I'll be like, oh, that's an interesting sensation. How fun. I'm not quite on the level that one of the monks, Father Norbert, I talk to him occasionally, and he deals with different chronic pain, and he jokes around. He says, I keep telling God I don't know how many more visitors I can welcome into my body, but I'm trying to be hospitable. I borrow a little wisdom from the Harry Potter series here. Any Harry Potter fans? Hagrid says in one of them, he says, what's coming will come, and we'll meet it when it does. And that's kind of what I say to myself when I wake up in the morning. What's coming will come, and I'll deal with it when it does. And here we go. There was a Zen master, Shunryu Suzuki, who said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there is one. And so you kind of have to go back to that mind of a child, like Jesus says, and just have an open mind to learning from the weird things that happen when you're suffering, and embrace them as part of the journey that you're on. Last one, best for last, I think, is gratitude. And I don't know about everyone else's experiences with suffering, but I know for me, the minute I get out of my attitude for gratitude, I'm doomed. Each day I can think about things to be thankful for, or I can complain about, or I can decide I'm going to complain about stuff that day. And if I go down the complaining route, it's impossible to stop once you start sliding down that slide. And your pain goes up, and things get worse and worse and worse in your mind. And so, in the midst of suffering, God's trying to teach me that I need to find things for which to be thankful every day. So if the pain hits at 3, I say, wow, God, thank you for helping me make it to 3. What a fantastic day. You know, if it hits as soon as I wake up in the morning, I go, wow, thanks for giving me a day off today, Lord. I don't have to do anything because the pain hits. I get to lay here in silence and dark and be quiet and listen today. Thank you for that. I mean, it doesn't, whatever it is, you gotta stay in an attitude that reflects gratitude. There's a couple Bible verses I'll throw out about gratitude real quick. There are 2. One is 1 Thessalonians, and there's a lot about gratitude in Scripture, but in 1 Thessalonians it says, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." So regardless of the circumstances, they're God's will. So give thanks. But my favorite, and I'm sure some of you could probably finish this sentence, Psalm 136 starts, "Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, and His love endures forever." If I have that, then, you know, in some ways I think I have everything. On a kind of a personal note to close this, I could be wrong, I don't know, but I sort of feel like when I'm able to finally internalize these qualities, because I really believe they're what God is trying to teach me, then maybe that's when my medical conditions will be resolved. But even if they aren't, I'm going to be that much further along in my path to sainthood that we're all on. So pain or no pain, suffering or no suffering, if I can internalize these with God's help, it's not going to be a bad thing, you know. And that's kind of part of that acceptance. Really hard for me to talk about, but my dad died a few years ago, and he was Basque, so he was like culturally Catholic, but he never said the word Mass or anything. I mean, he worshipped on the golf course. A few years before he had his stroke, I found out he had started identifying as a Catholic. So if people were talking religion, he'd say, "Oh, I'm a Catholic." I thought, well, that's cool, but that's not going to save him. You know, he just did not live any kind of a life of a person of faith at all. Well, then he had a stroke. And the stroke destroyed one half of his body. He couldn't use half his body. Couldn't talk. And basically was put in long-term care. And though I don't wish that, I certainly wouldn't wish that on my dad or anybody, it changed him in a big way. And he wanted to receive the anointing. He received communion occasionally. And for a week before he died, when nurses would come in, he kept pointing up, like he could see something. And they would say, "What's the matter, Barry? Is there something up there?" And he would nod, and like, "With the ceiling?" He was like, "No." And he kept pointing up, like he could see something. And then one day they came in to check on him before lights out, and he had passed. And you know, again, I don't know for sure, but I believe that he had to endure those last couple of years because it saved his soul in some way. You know, it turned his face toward Christ as opposed to everything else. And so, you know, there's different ways that we all are going to suffer, and no one's suffering is worse or better than anybody else's. But I think we just have to remind ourselves that it is part of being on the path to sainthood. The sainthood that we are all striving for, to be in heaven with Christ. And I want to close my talk before I'm going to say one other thing, but I want to close my talk with a great quote about sainthood. It's Viktor Frankl again in Man's Search for Meaning. It's so good, I love this quote. He says, "And today, you need no longer hesitate to use the word saints. Think of Father Maximilian Kolbe, who was starved and finally murdered by an injection of carbolic acid at Auschwitz, and who in 1983 was canonized. You may be prone to blame me for invoking examples that are the exception to the rule. You may, of course, ask whether we really need to refer to saints. Wouldn't it suffice just to refer to decent people? Well, it is true that they form a minority. More than that, they always will remain a minority. And yet I see therein the very challenge to join the minority. For the world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each one of us does his best. So let us be alert. Alert in a twofold sense. Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of. And since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake.